She built this kingdom with her bare hands, mapped its borders, bled for its treaties, burned for its people. And the man she gave everything to looked her in the eye and called her a traitor, not in private, not in a quiet room where mistakes can be unmade, in front of every alpha, every elder, every soul who ever bowed to her name. Serafina Vale didn't fall from grace. She was thrown. And the worst part? She saw it coming 3 months before it happened. If you're watching from Chicago, Houston, Atlanta, drop your city below. Hit that like button. Because this story, it doesn't end where he thinks it does. The morning the Queen lost everything started the same way every dangerous morning did. Quiet. Serafina Vale stood at the eastern window of the throne citadel before the household stirred, before the sentinels changed their watch, before the kitchen fires caught. She had done this every dawn for 11 years. Not from habit, from necessity. The Silver Dominion was a kingdom that rewarded those who looked at it clearly, without flattery, without the soft fog of wishful thinking. It punished everyone else. Below the window, the capital spread out in concentric rings. The market district, the pack quarters, the outer fortifications that she had personally redesigned after the border raid 6 years ago. She knew those walls the way she knew the lines of her own palms. She had argued for every reinforcement, every watchtower angle, every supply corridor. Kaelin had signed the orders. Serafina had understood what the orders meant. That was always how it worked between them. She pressed 2 fingers against the cold stone of the window ledge and let the chill travel up through her hand, her wrist, her forearm. It was a habit she had developed in the early years of her marriage, when she needed to remind herself that this place was real, that she had not imagined any of it. The stone was real. The kingdom was real. What she had built here was real. What she had been hearing for the past 3 months was also real. The whispers had started small, the way infections always do. A word dropped in a corridor, a look exchanged across a banquet table that lasted half a second too long, a conversation that stopped the moment she entered a room. She had cataloged every one of them with the same methodical attention she brought to border intelligence reports. A queen who ignored whispers did not remain a queen. Lyra Thorne's name had appeared in 17 separate conversations Serafina had tracked in the last 90 days. 17. Spoken by palace functionaries, by 2 of Kaelin's inner council, by a junior sentinel who had no business knowing Lyra Thorne's name at all. The woman herself moved through the citadel like smoke, always present, never quite accountable for her presence, always with a reason that was just plausible enough to deflect scrutiny. Serafina had brought this to Kaelin 6 weeks ago. She had chosen her words carefully, precisely, without accusation she couldn't yet substantiate. She had laid out what she observed. She had asked for a quiet inquiry. Kaelin had looked at her with something she had not seen in his face before. Not anger, not dismissal, but a kind of exhausted impatience, as though she were a council matter he had already settled in his mind and resented having to revisit. He said she was reading shadows. He said Lyra was a trusted envoy with deep connections in the Northern Alliance territories, that her access to the Citadel was authorized and necessary. He said Serafina's concerns reflected a narrowness of perspective that, frankly, he had been worried about for some time now. She had stood in his private study and heard those words come out of the mouth of the man she had been beside for 11 years, and understood, with absolute cold clarity, that something had already happened that she didn't have the full picture of yet. She had not pressed further. Not then. She had walked out of the study with her spine straight and her face composed, the way she had learned to do in the first year of their marriage when the older council members watched her for any sign she wasn't built for the weight she carried. She had walked back to her own quarters and stood at her window and thought for a very long time. Then she had started doing something she had never needed to do before in this kingdom. She had started building a record. Rena was waiting when Serafina turned from the window. Her head attendant had served her since before the wedding. A compact, precise woman in her mid-40s whose loyalty had never required testing because it had never wavered. Rena set a cup of brewed root tea on the small table without being asked and moved to the wardrobe with practiced efficiency. "The council session begins at the second bell," Rena said. Her voice carried no inflection, but she glanced at Serafina once with the particular quality of attention that meant she had noticed something and was waiting to be asked. "I know," Serafina said. She picked up the tea but didn't drink. "What is it?" Rena's hands paused over the formal robe for a fraction of a second. "The Eastern Corridor, third watch, last night. Sentinel Dovar was removed from his rotation." Serafina set the cup down. "On whose authority?" "The reassignment order was issued under the High Council seal, but the council session that would have authorized it wasn't held until this morning." Rena turned back to the wardrobe as if she had said nothing out of the ordinary. "There's a gap of 11 hours. Serafina was quiet for a moment. The Eastern Corridor was the only unmonitored access route between the Citadel's inner chambers and the secondary guest wing, where Lyra Thorne had been housed for the past 3 weeks under the justification of extended diplomatic negotiations. Whose name was on the order? It bore no individual signature, only the seal. The seal that sat in Kaelin's private study. The seal that had never, in 11 years of Serafina's knowledge, been used without his explicit direction. She held that information in the front of her mind and let it find its correct position among everything else she already knew. Then she said, "Thank you, Rena," in a tone that ended the subject, and began dressing for the council session. Set. The High Council chamber occupied the crown of the Citadel's central tower, a room designed to be imposing, a room that had worked very hard at it. The ceiling was carved obsidian, the floor pale stone quarried from the sacred territories, the table made from the same iron hardwood that formed the throne. Serafina had sat at this table for 11 years. She knew which of the 14 chairs creaked, which council member always arrived with ink stains on his right hand, which of them required 2 cups of water before they would say anything useful in the morning. She took her seat to the left of the high position, the Luna's seat, the Queen's seat, the seat that had always been hers. Lyra Thorne was already in the room. She stood to the right of the chamber, near the windows, dressed in the formal acknowledgement of a guest envoy, which meant she had no seat at the table but could observe the proceedings. Serafina clocked her the moment she walked in and did not let her gaze linger. She set her folded hands on the table and waited for the session to begin. Kaelin arrived 3 minutes after the second bell, a small lateness he had developed in recent months. A lateness that Serafina recognized as the particular behavior of someone who has been told their time is more valuable than other people's. He wore formal armor she didn't recognize. Not the standard council ceremonial set. Something newer, heavier, with Northern Pack metalwork in the shoulder fittings. She had never seen that armor before. That meant he had acquired it in the last 6 weeks, which meant there had been a transaction she didn't know about, which meant someone had arranged it for him. He sat. He glanced at her once. Not the look of a man addressing his partner, but the look of a man checking on something he expected to cause him a problem and was preparing to manage. She kept her hands folded. The session opened with the standard border reports. The senior intelligence officer, Commander Bren, laid out the situation along the eastern frontier. 3 minor territorial incursions in the past month, 2 from the Ironmore Pack, and 1 from a splinter group the scouts couldn't fully identify. The response protocol had been activated. Reinforcements were being positioned. Serafina had read these reports before Bren delivered them. She always did. "The eastern frontier holds," she said when Bren finished. "But the splinter group concerns me more than the Ironmore incursions. Their movement pattern doesn't match any pack we have on record. The scout reports put them within 4 miles of the secondary grain routes 3 times in the last 2 weeks. She let that land before continuing. "Someone told them where those routes are." The room shifted. Not dramatically, but the quality of the silence changed. "The grain routes are common knowledge," said Lord Cavis, the council member whose seat was closest to Kaelin's right. He was a tall, thin man with an elaborate sense of his own authority. He had been friendlier with Lyra Thorne than his position required. Any experienced scouting force could map them from terrain alone. "Terrain mapping takes weeks," Serafina said. "These movements happened across 3 separate incidents over 14 days, all targeting different segments of the route, none of them overlapping. That's not terrain mapping, that's pre-existing intelligence." "My queen raises a point worth investigation," said Elder Sova from the far end of the table. She was the oldest member of the council, a woman whose influence predated Kaelin's reign and who had never, in Serafina's experience, spoken to Phil's silence. When Sova spoke, it was because she had decided something mattered.
Perhaps a quiet inquiry. The matter is already being handled, Kalen said. His voice landed flat, with a weight that wasn't authority exactly, but was designed to feel like it. Serafina watched him. He hadn't looked at her since the armor observation she'd made in her own head. Through what mechanism? She asked. Through the mechanism of my judgment, he said. The room went very, very still. This was new. In 11 years, Kalen had been many things in council sessions. Decisive, sometimes impatient, occasionally wrong and unwilling to say so, but he had never used that particular construction. My judgment, singular, closed, no negotiation. She was aware, without looking, that Lyra Thorne had not moved from her position near the windows. Your judgment, Serafina said, in the same even register she would use to discuss grain supply numbers, is a resource like any other. It benefits from intelligence. I'm offering intelligence. You're offering conjecture, Kalen said. And frankly, Serafina, this isn't the first time in recent months that your conjecture has taken up council time that could be better spent. 2 council members looked at the table. Bren's face went completely neutral. Elder Sova looked at Serafina with an expression that was not quite pity, but was close enough to make Serafina's chest tighten. She breathed through it, let it register and pass without touching her posture or her face. I understand, she said, and she did understand. That was the worst of it.
The session ended an hour later without a resolution on the eastern frontier that satisfied her. Serafina walked out of the chamber and down the corridor toward her own wing and managed 12 steps before she heard the footsteps behind her. Serafina. She stopped. Turned. Kalen had followed her out of the chamber alone, which meant he had sent the others ahead. He stood 6 feet away from her in the corridor, in that armor she didn't recognize, and his face had the look of a man who has been rehearsing something and isn't sure how much of the rehearsal is showing. I need to speak with you privately, he said. This is private, she said. Speak. Something moved through his face, irritation, or something older than irritation that had worn irritation's shape for so long it forgot what it used to be. He stepped closer, and she didn't step back. She had never stepped back from him in 11 years, and she wasn't starting now. You can't keep doing this, he said. The challenges in council, the questions that are really accusations dressed up as questions. Every meeting you come in looking for something to flag, something to question, something to... I come in prepared, she said. I come in having read every report that crosses the intelligence desk. I come in having talked to the border scouts, the grain master, the trade envoys. That's not obstruction. That's the job. The job, he repeated, and the word sounded wrong in his mouth, like he'd borrowed it from someone else's sentence. The job is what I define it to be. Kalen? She said his name without softness, without cruelty, with the precision of someone trying to cut through to the man she had known before whatever was happening to him had started. Something is wrong. In this kingdom, in this citadel, and you know it, and you're choosing not to look at it, and I need you to tell me why. For a moment, 1 moment, maybe 3 seconds long, she saw him, the real him. The one who had stood beside her on the eastern fortifications 6 years ago and asked for her assessment when 2 of his generals were telling him everything was fine and her numbers said otherwise. The one who had learned, in the early years, that her ability to see structure in chaos was not a challenge to his authority, but a resource that had saved them both more than once. That man looked at her from inside the one standing in the corridor and seemed to understand something. Then Lyra Thorne's voice came from the far end of the corridor. My king, the northern delegation is waiting. Kalen turned toward the sound before Serafina could watch what happened in his face during the turning. When he looked back at her, whatever she had seen was gone. We'll continue this later, he said. Will we? She said. Not a question. He walked toward Lyra's voice without answering. Serafina stood in the corridor and watched him go and listened to the thing inside her chest that she had been refusing to name for 3 months settle into its final shape. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. Not exactly. It was the recognition that she had already lost the argument she was trying to make, that the ground had shifted while she was looking somewhere else, and that the only question remaining was what she was going to do about it.
She turned and walked back to her wing. She had work to do.
What? The evidence came together in pieces, the way evidence always did. Not as a revelation, but as an accumulation. A document here, a testimony there. The pattern hidden inside things that each looked innocent on their own and became something else when you placed them side by side. Over the following 2 weeks, Serafina worked at night, after Rena had left and the citadel had quieted, in the small back study that connected to her quarters through a passage most of the palace staff had forgotten existed. She had maps spread across the floor. She had transcriptions of conversations, her own careful notes, taken from memory, never written in real time. She had copies of procurement records she'd obtained through the archive clerk on the justification of routine audit review. What the document showed, assembled in order, was this. 3 months ago, a private communication had passed between a Northern Pact coalition called the Ashvale Alliance and a contact within the Silver Dominion Citadel. The communication was routed through a secondary trade house in the border territories, the kind of routing used when someone wanted deniability. The content of the communication was not available to her, but the physical route was, because the trade house had been audited for unrelated financial irregularities 6 weeks prior, and the audit records listed every correspondence that had passed through its accounts in the prior quarter. The contact's identity was shielded behind a code designation, but the code designation had appeared twice more, in 2 different procurement documents for items that had been delivered to the guest wing 3 weeks ago. The guest wing where Lyra Thorne was housed. It wasn't proof. It wasn't the kind of thing she could stand up in council and present as proof, but it was enough for a real inquiry, conducted by people with actual investigative authority, to confirm or disprove within a week. She needed Kalen to authorize that inquiry. She requested a private meeting. His steward informed her that the king's schedule was committed for the next 3 days, but that he would pass along the request. She sent a written message through official channels, flagged as sensitive. No response came. On the 4th day, she intercepted Kalen in the lower corridor himself, on his way out of a weapons training session, still in sparring clothes, 2 of his personal guards flanking him. "Kalen," she said. "1 hour, in private. I have something that requires your attention." He stopped. He looked at her with a tiredness that was new, a specific heaviness around the eyes that she associated with someone who wasn't sleeping enough or was doing something their body knew was wrong. "Serafina, Sham," he said, and there was a flatness to it that scared her more than anger would have. "I know what you've been doing, the archive requests, the audit review, the questions you've been asking around the trade routes." He paused. "I've been told about all of it." She was very still. "Who told you?" "People who are concerned about you," he said. "About your preoccupations, your fixation on things that aren't your authority to investigate." "Lyra told you," she said. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He just said, "I'm asking you to stop. This is the last time I'm going to ask. And if I tell you that what I found suggests she is communicating with your enemies," Serafina said, "and that those communications line up with 3 months of deteriorating conditions on the eastern frontier, and that the splinter group whose movements we flagged in council is operating with information they could only have received from inside this citadel, then I'd say you've constructed a story from pieces of nothing because you're afraid," he said. His voice didn't rise. That was almost worse than if it had. "And I'd say that whatever else you are, Serafina, this—" He gestured at the space between them, at the corridor, at the invisible map she had pinned to the wall of her back study. "This is not the behavior of a queen. This is the behavior of someone with a personal grievance who has lost their perspective." She stood in the corridor and let those words reach every part of her. Let them do what they were meant to do. Let herself feel the full weight of what it meant to be told by the person whose judgment she had depended on for 11 years, that she had lost her perspective, that her evidence was a story, that her concern was personal. She waited until the feeling passed through her completely and left behind whatever was underneath it. "All right," she said. He looked at her like he wasn't sure what all right meant. "All right," she said again. "I hear you." She stepped back and let him pass. He walked down the corridor with his guards. He did not look back. She stood alone in the corridor for a long time after he was gone,
and then she went back to her study and kept working.
The accusation arrived on a morning 15 days later, delivered not privately, but in full council session, before every elder and commander and ranking member of the Silver Dominion's governing body. Seraphina had been in her seat for 6 minutes when Kaelin entered the chamber with Lyra Thorne beside him. Not behind him, the way a guest envoy should walk. Beside him. At his right shoulder. In the space that had a name. Every person in the room noticed. She watched them notice. Kaelin sat. Lyra remained standing just behind his right shoulder, and her face held the particular composition of someone who has been waiting for a moment for a long time and has arrived at it and is working very hard not to show how much they're enjoying it. "Before council opens," Kaelin said, "I have a matter to address." Seraphina's hands were flat on the table. She did not fold them. "Over the past several weeks," he said, "evidence has been brought to my attention concerning activities within this citadel that constitute a threat to the stability of the Silver Dominion." He paused. "Activities that originate from within this council chamber itself." The room was completely silent. "Queen Seraphina Vale," Kaelin said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had prepared this, who had rehearsed it until the preparation didn't show, has been conducting unauthorized communications with parties outside the Dominion's recognized alliance structure. Evidence suggests these communications include intelligence sharing that has directly compromised our eastern frontier operations. No one moved. No one breathed. Seraphina was aware of every face in the room, the way you become aware of every tree in a forest, when something is moving through it that you can't see yet. "The evidence," she said, and her voice was steady, "was presented to the council by whom?" "By a trusted source with direct knowledge of your activities," Kaelin said. "Name the source," she said. "The source is protected." "You are accusing me of treason in open council," she said. "Name the source." Kaelin's jaw set. "Lyra Thorne witnessed your unauthorized communication directly. She is prepared to provide full testimony." Seraphina looked at Lyra. Lyra looked back at her with a face that was arranged into the careful expression of someone reluctantly telling a truth. The care in the arrangement was the tell. Actual reluctance didn't look like that. Actual reluctance looked like something breaking. What Lyra's face showed was construction, and every person in this room who knew what they were looking at could see it. But knowledge and power are different things. And right now, in this room, the power was not evenly distributed. "What she witnessed," Seraphina said, speaking to the room rather than to Kaelin alone, "was my investigation into her own activities. I have documented evidence of communications between a Citadel contact and the Ashvale Alliance, routed through the Border Trade House over a period of 3 months. The communications align precisely with the deterioration of our eastern frontier, with the splinter group intelligence failure we discussed in this very chamber, and with a series of procurement transactions traceable to the guest wing of this citadel." She paused. "I have the documentation. I'm prepared to present it now." "You won't be presenting anything," Kaelin said. The words fell like something breaking. "Under my authority as king of the Silver Dominion," he said, and the words had the sound of something that had been decided already, before this room, before this morning, before any of them walked through that door. "And in light of the evidence presented against you, I am hereby removing Seraphina Vale from her title and position as Luna Queen of this kingdom." Someone at the far end of the table made a sound, a small, involuntary sound. Seraphina didn't look to see who it was. "Effective immediately," Kaelin continued, "she is banished from the Silver Dominion's territories. She will be given 2 hours to collect personal items. She will leave under escort." Elder Sova's chair scraped back from the table. "My king!" "The matter is settled," Kaelin said. The flatness again. The closed door. "This council session is over." He stood. Lyra moved when he moved, a half step, like a shadow that had learned to anticipate its source. Seraphina sat at the council table that she had occupied for 11 years and did not move as the room around her began its stunned, fractured dispersal. She watched Kaelin walk toward the chamber door. She watched the council members who did not look at her and the ones who did. She watched Lyra Thorne pass through the doorway without glancing back. She sat until the chamber was nearly empty, until only Rena was left standing 3 feet away, with a face that was ash-pale and perfectly composed, because Rena had been trained by watching Serafina, and she knew that composure right now was the only thing. Then Serafina rose from her chair. She picked up the folder of documents she had brought to this session, the evidence she had assembled over 15 days of night work, the documentation that no one had allowed her to present. She held it in both hands. "Rena," she said, "I need you to go to Elder Sova's private chambers tonight, not through the main corridors, through the East Passage, and I need you to give her something for safekeeping." She set the folder on the table between them. "Only Sova. And tell her—" She stopped, thought about what needed to be said with precision. "Tell her that what's inside explains what she saw today. Tell her I'll need it back when the time comes." Rena took the folder without hesitation. The escort was waiting in the outer corridor. 4 sentinels, armored, faces professionally blank. She knew 2 of them by name. They had trained under the protocols she had helped design. They stood in the corridor and could not meet her eyes. She walked between them without speaking. She walked the familiar corridors of the citadel she had defended and built and governed for 11 years, and she did not look at it with grief. She looked at it with the particular attention of someone memorizing something they intend to return to. 2 hours later, Serafina Vale walked through the outer gate of the Silver Dominion capital with a traveling pack. No title, no escort, and the names of 3 border contacts she trusted enough to reach. The gate closed behind her. She stood in the open road and felt the full weight of the morning settle across her shoulders and breathed through it, the way you breathe through anything that wants to take you down, not by fighting it, but by taking it into you and finding out what's still standing when it's done. She was still standing. She turned east. The Eastern Territories were wild, unscouted in many sections, dangerous in ways that the Interior Kingdom pretended not to be. She had read enough of the scout reports to know which dangers were real and which were legend. She knew where water ran under the dry plateau. She knew which settlements at the edge of the sacred territories would trade for labor. She knew things Kaelin had never needed to know because she had always been the one who knew them, so he didn't have to. She had been building her knowledge of this kingdom for 11 years. Now she was going to find out what she could do with it alone. She walked east until the citadel was gone behind the tree line, and then she kept walking, and she was 3 hours out and moving through a dry creek bed in the shadow of the eastern ridgeline when her foot caught something in the dust. She stopped, crouched. It was a message cylinder, the kind used by Dominion border scouts for urgent relay communications. Sealed with the code pattern used by the scouts who operated on the far edge of the sacred territories, the ones who reported directly to the senior intelligence desk. She turned it over. The exterior bore the mark of Scout Unit 7, the unit that covered the secondary grain routes. The cylinder was sealed, but had been placed in this specific creek bed, in this specific hollow, with deliberate concealment, shoved under a shelf of rock where it would be found only by someone who knew the terrain and happened to be moving at ground level. Someone had put this here for her to find, someone who knew she would be coming this way. She broke the seal. Inside was a single piece of folded parchment, a map, hand-drawn, precise, of the eastern frontier. And marked on the map in red ink at 4 separate locations were encampment symbols she recognized. Not the Iron Moor Pack, not the unidentified Splinter Group. Full military formations. 30 to 40 units each, positioned along the 4 major access corridors into the Silver Dominion's interior. At the bottom of the map, in the handwriting of someone who had been trained not to identify themselves, but whose pen pressure she knew as well as she knew her own, were 8 words. They move at new moon, 12 days. Come back. Serafina held the map in both hands and looked at the scale of what was drawn on it and understood, with the full force of everything she was, that she had just miscalculated something fundamental. She had thought she was watching Lyra Thorne manipulate a king. She hadn't understood, until this moment, that the manipulation of the king was never the point. The point was the kingdom itself. And whoever had positioned those formations along the frontier corridors had timed their advance to begin at the moment the Silver Dominion's queen had been stripped of her authority, her access, and her ability to warn anyone of what was coming. 12 days. She folded the map, put it in her pack. stood up in the dry creek bed with the eastern ridgeline above her and the citadel somewhere behind her, and no title, no army, no institutional power of any kind. She thought about Kalen sitting in that council chamber making decisions with the wrong information and the wrong person at his right shoulder. She thought about the grain routes, the water supply corridors, the 3 secondary fortifications that had never been reinforced because the full council hadn't been able to agree on the budget allocation, and she had not pushed hard enough at the time, and she had known, even then, that she should have pushed harder. She thought about Elder Sova, who had scraped her chair back from the table. She thought about 12 days. Then she stopped thinking about all of it, because thinking wasn't what the next 12 days required. She turned east, not away from the kingdom this time, toward the eastern frontier, toward whoever had left that map for her to find, toward the thing that was coming whether she was ready or not. She was moving at a run before she reached the end of the creek bed, and the only thought in her head was clean and simple and had nothing to do with what she'd lost and everything to do with what she still had. 11 years of knowledge, a map with 8 words on it, in 12 days. It would have to be enough. She ran until her lungs burned past the point where burning meant anything, and then she kept running. The eastern ridgeline was not forgiving terrain. The creek bed gave way to loose shale after the first mile, then to a broken plateau where the scrub grew low and sharp and grabbed at her ankles with the indifference of things that had never needed to care about human passage. She had read the scout reports. She knew the terrain on paper. Paper and ground were 2 different things, and her court shoes were not made for either. She stopped at the top of the first rise, not because she needed to rest, but because she needed to look. Below her, the Silver Dominion capital was already small, the citadel's central tower just visible above the tree line, the outer walls catching the afternoon light. From up here it looked like a model of itself, a thing that could be held in 2 hands. She had built half of what made that city function, and she had been walked out of it in 2 hours. She filed that feeling in the part of her that was not permitted to speak right now and turned back to the map. The encampment markings were precise. Whoever had drawn this had ground-level knowledge, the kind you got from boots, not from riding above the terrain on horseback. The 4 positions corresponded to the 4 natural choke points in the eastern approaches, the same choke point she had flagged in a border security proposal 2 years ago that Kalen's senior general had called excessive. The proposal had been shelved. The choke points were unfortified. Someone had counted on that. 12 days to new moon. The formations marked on this map represented somewhere between 1,200 and 1,600 fighters if the unit spacing was accurate. Against an unwarned, leadership-fractured Silver Dominion, with a compromised king and a frontier she already knew was undermanned, those numbers were not an invasion force. They were a certainty. She folded the map back into her pack and calculated what she had. 2 days of provisions. A knife. The traveling clothes on her back and the court dress she had not bothered to change out of, which was now unsuitable for this terrain in ways she did not have time to address. 3 contact names on the eastern settlements. Traders, not soldiers, but traders who moved through the border territories and knew things. And 11 years of knowing how this kingdom breathed. She moved. The settlement at Dusk Hollow was not on any official map. That was the point of it. It occupied a shallow valley 2 hours east of the sacred territory boundary, built around a natural spring, populated by the particular kind of people who had left the interior kingdom for reasons that varied but shared a common quality. They were done being governed by someone else's mistakes. Serafina walked in at dusk, which was either good timing or irony, and the first person she saw was a woman sitting outside the largest building with a short blade across her knees and the look of someone who made it a professional habit to see things before they became problems. The woman looked Serafina up and down once, the court dress, the road dust, the pack, the absence of an escort, and said nothing for 4 seconds. "You're a long way from wherever that dress belongs," she said finally. "I know," Serafina said. "I'm looking for a man named Devrin, the trade contact. I was told he operates out of this settlement." "Who told you that?" "The scout who left a message cylinder in the creek bed 3 hours east of the capital." Another silence. The woman's hand moved on the blade. Not raising it, just repositioning, the way a person shifts their weight when they're deciding something. "Devrin's inside," she said. You're going to want to lose the dress before you talk to him. You're walking around looking like a target. I don't have anything to change into. The woman stood up. She was taller than she'd looked sitting. I do. Come on. Her name was Mira, and she asked exactly 3 questions while Serafina changed into borrowed clothes behind the partition in the back room. How bad was the road? How many days to new moon? And was there going to be a fight? Serafina answered all 3 with the same precision she used in intelligence briefings, because Mira was clearly the kind of person who respected that and had no use for the other kind. 12 days, Mira said when Serafina finished. And you're alone. Right now. Right now, Mira repeated. She seemed to find this specific rather than alarming, which told Serafina something useful about her. Devron's been waiting for someone from the capital, didn't know it was going to be you. What did he expect? Someone with more backup and less court dust on their face. She tilted her head toward the main room. Go. Devron was a compact man in his late 50s with the kind of stillness that came from having survived things by being very careful about what he reacted to. He was seated at a table covered in papers and looked up when Serafina entered with the expression of someone who has been expecting bad news and is professionally prepared for it to be worse than anticipated. My queen, he said. Not anymore, she said. She sat down across from him without being invited. The map was yours. The map was Scout Farron's. I got it to the creek bed. He looked at her face, then at the pack she'd set on the table, then back at her face. I heard what happened this morning. Word moves fast on the frontier. Who sent you the map? Farron brought it in 6 days ago, said his unit had been tracking movement for 3 weeks and kept filing reports that weren't being acknowledged. He came to me because he didn't know where else to go and he's 22 years old and scared. Where is he now? Resting. He ran 2 days straight to get here. She pulled out the map and set it flat between them. Talk me through what you know about these positions. Devron looked at the map. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the table and marked 4 small additional points near the northern edge, movements she hadn't seen in Farron's original data. These came in this morning from my other contacts. The formations are staged, but they're not static. The northern flank has been shifting, probing the boundary for response activity. They're testing whether anyone's watching. Anyone is watching, she said. I'm watching. What else? There's a 5th position that Farron didn't mark because he wasn't sure of it. Devron tapped the map southeast of the main cluster. A smaller force, maybe 200, positioned not along the access corridors like the others, but behind them. Reserve force or command element, Serafina said. That's where the coordination comes from. You don't put your reserve behind the assault positions in terrain like this. You put your command structure there so they have sight lines on all 4 corridors, but enough distance to redirect if something breaks wrong. Devron looked at her steadily for a moment. You want to tell me how you plan to do anything about any of this without an army? I don't need an army, she said. I need to make enough noise in the right places that the kingdom gets its eyes open before the new moon. The kingdom has an army. It just currently has the wrong information. The king just threw you out. The king, she said, and she kept her voice level because Devron needed to hear what she said and not what she felt. Currently believes what Lyra Thorne tells him. Lyra Thorne is connected to whoever is running those formations out there, which means the best thing that can happen to this kingdom right now is for someone to break that connection before those units start moving. You can't go back into the capital. I don't have to go back into the capital. I have to get the right information to the right people inside the capital, and I have to do it in a way that can't be dismissed or buried. She looked at the map. 12 days. Devron was quiet for a moment. Then he said, There are others. People on this side of the territory line who left the Dominion for different reasons but never stopped caring about it. Farron's unit isn't the only one that's been sending reports that disappear. I've had 4 scouts come through here in the last 2 weeks, all of them with the same story. Intelligence filed, no response, no escalation, no authorization to act. They're sitting on their positions and watching and doing nothing because they don't have orders and they're not going to move without orders. They'll have orders, she said. Give me a day to talk to Farron, then I need riders. I can get you riders. He looked at her court dress posture in Mira's borrowed clothes and the particular quality of attention she was paying to the map, the quality that wasn't just reading it, but memorizing the next 3 decisions at the same time. "What's the plan?" "The plan," she said, "is to prove what I couldn't prove in that council chamber this morning, publicly, with witnesses who can't be dismissed." She met his eyes. "And the plan is to do it before Lyra Thorne has any idea it's coming." Utsk. Farron was younger than she expected. 22, Devrin had said, and she'd thought she understood what that meant until she saw him sitting on a cot in the back room, eating cold food with the mechanical focus of someone in the late stages of exhaustion. And she registered that he had the face of someone who had not been prepared for what he'd seen and had run 2 days straight because running felt like the only thing that was doing anything. He looked up when she walked in and went very still. "Scout Farron," she said. She didn't use a title for herself. She sat on the cot across from him. "Tell me what you saw, all of it, from the beginning," he told her. It took 40 minutes. She interrupted twice, once to clarify a location, once to ask about a specific timing detail, and the rest of the time she just listened. Real listening, the kind that took everything in without deciding what it meant until the full picture was available. Farron noticed. She watched it change something in his posture. The way being actually heard by someone who knows what to do with information is different from being heard by someone who doesn't. When he finished, she said, "You did the right thing." He looked at her with the particular expression of someone who is deeply tired and has been afraid they didn't do enough, and is not entirely sure they're allowed to feel relief yet. "I filed 7 reports," he said. 7. They all disappeared. I didn't know if... He stopped. "I didn't know if something was wrong with the system or if I was wrong about what I was seeing." "You weren't wrong," she said. "The system has a problem right now. That's not your failure." She paused. "I need to ask you something. When you brought the map to Devrin, who else knew you were coming here?" He shook his head. "No one. I told my unit I was going to scout the southern approach for water sources. Standard cover rotation." "Does anyone in your unit have contact with personnel inside the Citadel outside of the official reporting channels?" He thought about that. Careful thought. Not quick denial. She respected it. "Lynette might. She grew up near the capital, still has family there, but she wasn't..." He stopped himself, reconsidered. "She was gone for 3 hours 2 days before I left. Said she was checking a supply cache. I didn't think about it. Serafina filed that information. Go back to your unit. Be normal. Don't act like anything has changed." She met his eyes and held them until she was sure he'd heard the specific weight of what she was about to say. "Do not file any more reports through the official channel. They're not going to the intelligence desk. Someone is catching them before they get there, and now that I know that, we're going to use it." He blinked. "Use it how?" "We're going to send exactly 1 more report," she said, "and it's going to say something very specific. And then we're going to watch who reacts to it." Chad. She worked through the night at Devrin's table. Mira brought food she didn't touch until it went cold and then ate standing up. The plan took shape the way good plans did, not as a single structure built from the top down, but as a set of interlocking pieces, each one designed to hold even if the others shifted. The core of it was evidence she already had, combined with evidence she was going to generate. The documentation Rena had taken to Elder Sova was one piece. The map was another. The scout reports, the originals, which Farron had kept physical copies of because he was 22 and scared and instinctively didn't trust a system that kept eating his work, were a third. The 4th piece was the false report, the one she was going to use as bait, the one that would flush out the Citadel contact who had been intercepting frontier intelligence for the past 3 months. If that contact reacted to the bait, she would have a name. If she had a name, she had a thread. If she had a thread, she could pull on it until the whole thing came apart in the open, where everyone could see it. She was halfway through drafting the bait report when Mira came in from outside and said, in the flat voice she used for things that needed immediate attention, "You've got company." Serafina looked up. 2 riders. They've been moving fast. They're not in frontier gear, and they're not soldiers. Mira paused. "One of them asked for you by name." Only 3 people outside the Citadel had known she was heading for Dusk Hollow: Devrin,
Farron, and whoever had put that message cylinder in the creek bed, which meant the scout network, which meant Farron's unit, which meant possibly someone who had been in the wrong place when Farron talked to the wrong person. She stood up.
Where are they? I put them in the outer yard. I didn't let them in until you said. She walked out to the outer yard. The two riders were standing next to their horses in the low firelight, and she recognized neither of them until the one on the left stepped forward into the light and she saw the insignia on the collar. Not official insignia, but the personal mark she had designed years ago for her own private communication network. The one she had built quietly over a decade, because a queen who had no independent intelligence channel was a queen who knew only what she was allowed to know. The insignia meant this person had been activated by someone she trusted. The writer handed her a sealed letter. She broke the seal. Inside was Rena's handwriting, compressed, precise, the handwriting of someone who had been taught by Serafina herself to say the necessary thing in the smallest possible space. 7 words. Sova has called an emergency session, tomorrow. And below it, in a hand she hadn't expected, the council is fracturing. Come back before it's too late. She turned the letter over. No other name. Just those lines. She stood in the outer yard in borrowed clothes with the firelight against her face and held the letter in both hands and understood that the pieces had just accelerated past the timeline she had set. Tomorrow. Not 12 days. Tomorrow. If Sova had called an emergency session, it meant something had broken open inside the Citadel. Some piece of evidence had surfaced, or someone had finally said out loud what everyone had been refusing to say. And if the council was fracturing, it meant Kaylin's position was no longer as solid as Lyra had built it to be, which meant Lyra would know it too, which meant Lyra was already moving to consolidate what she could before the fracture spread. 12 days. That was how long she had thought she had. She looked at the map in her pack, the eastern frontier formations, the 1,200 soldiers positioned to move at new moon. Tomorrow, the council was meeting. Today, Lyra still had Kaylin's ear. If the emergency session happened without the frontier intelligence, without the full picture, without the documentation that proved the connection between Lyra's communications and the formations outside the kingdom's walls, then whatever fracture Sova had opened could be closed again. Lyra only needed one good story and one king who still wanted to believe her. Serafina folded the letter, put it in her pack beside the map. She turned to Mira. I need a fast horse, and I need to be moving within the hour. Mira looked at her. The capital just exiled you this morning. I know. If you walk back in there, I know. A silence. Mira's face moved through something. Not doubt, exactly, but the specific assessment of someone recalculating what they're dealing with. The horse in the far stable, she said finally. Faster than anything else I've got. She's fresh. She paused. Don't get yourself killed before you finish whatever this is. Serafina was already moving toward the stable. She saddled the horse herself in the dark, working by feel and the dim light from the settlement, and she did not let herself think about what she was riding toward, about the gates, about the council chamber, about Kaylin's face when she walked back into a room she had been expelled from by his own public order this morning. She thought about the formations on the map. She thought about 1,200 soldiers in 12 days and the singular advantage she had over everyone who was currently moving pieces on this board without knowing she was still on it. They thought she was gone. She pulled herself into the saddle. She turned the horse west, toward the capital, toward the kingdom she had built, and the king who had discarded her, and the woman who had engineered it all from a guest wing with no accountability and the full confidence that her opponent had been permanently removed from play. Serafina set her heels and rode. Behind her, Dusk Hollow's firelight shrank and disappeared. Ahead of her, somewhere in the dark, the Silver Dominion's capital was going to wake up tomorrow morning and sit down to a council session that was about to become something none of them had prepared for. She was 2 hours out at a hard gallop when the first scout patrol spotted her. Frontier scouts, not Citadel soldiers, which meant Farron's network was watching the road the way she'd hoped. The lead scout pulled his horse across her path and she reined up hard, the horse throwing her forward before catching. The scout's hand was on his blade before he recognized her face. He stopped, recalibrated. Serafina Vale. Yes, she said. How many of you are out here? 12 riders on this road, more on the southern approach. Is the Citadel's main gate being watched by Citadel soldiers or Frontier scouts? He blinked. Both. But the Frontier scouts answer to the unit commanders, not the palace guard. She looked at him. The horse was heaving under her, foam at the bit. I need to be inside that gate before dawn, and I need it to happen without the palace guard knowing until I'm already through. Is that something you can make happen? He held her gaze for a long moment. He was a soldier. He had orders. He had a reporting structure. He also had, Serafina could see from the way he was holding himself, the particular conflict of a person who has been watching from a distance while something goes wrong and has been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to show up and tell him what to do about it. Yes, he said. Then move, she said. We don't have time. He moved. And in the capital, in the Citadel guest wing, Lyra Thorne was standing at the window of her room looking east at the dark, and her face was not the careful arrangement it wore in public, but something older and more honest, and she was looking at the eastern road with the specific attention of someone checking on a problem she had considered solved. She was still looking when her private messenger knocked twice on her door, entered, and handed her a small folded note. She read it again. Her hand closed around it slowly. When did this come in? She said. 20 minutes ago. Scout relay from the eastern approaches. And the source? Anonymous, Frontier Network. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Wake the council liaison. Tell him I need an audience with the king within the hour. She set the note on the table and smoothed it flat with one finger, the way a person smooths something they are deciding what to do about. And tell him to bring the arrest orders we discussed. The messenger left. Lyra stood at the window and looked east and understood that the woman she had spent 3 months removing from the board was not, in fact, gone. The question was whether she could finish this before Serafina walked through that gate. The answer was going to determine everything. She made it through the gate 40 minutes before dawn. The Frontier scout, his name was Aldrich, she learned during the hard ride in, had been as good as his word. He knew the patrol rotation, knew the 2 palace guards who covered the eastern postern gate between the 3rd and 4th watch, knew that the shift change happened 6 minutes late because the outgoing guard always stopped to talk to the kitchen worker who brought him food at the end of his rotation. 6 minutes was enough. She went through the postern on foot, horse left with Aldrich outside. No light, no announcement. Just a woman in borrowed Frontier clothes moving through the Citadel's outer grounds like she knew exactly where she was going, which she did, because she had helped design the grounds layout and knew every blind spot in the lantern coverage. She went to Elder Sova's private quarters first. The old woman was already awake. Serafina had not expected otherwise. Sova was the kind of person who slept lightly, by calculation rather than temperament, who had learned decades ago that the hours before dawn were when the most important decisions got made, and that being unconscious during them was a luxury she couldn't afford. Rena was there too, which meant Rena had moved faster than Serafina had any right to expect. The folder was on Sova's table, open, every document laid out with the careful order of someone who had spent the night reading and rereading and understanding. Sova looked at Serafina in the doorway and said nothing for 3 full seconds. She had the face of someone absorbing the weight of a thing they had already suspected but not yet permitted themselves to fully believe. Sit down, Sova said. I don't have time to sit. Then stand and listen, because I'm only going to say this once. Sova moved to the table and put one finger on the top document. I called the emergency session this morning because last night Commander Bren came to me privately. He's had the same suspicions you have. He's been watching the intelligence reports get filed and watching the responses not come, and he finally came to me because he's a soldier, and he ran out of the kind of patience that lets you keep doing nothing. She looked up. He brought 3 documents I hadn't seen before. Supply orders. Cross-referenced with the border procurement records you gathered. They complete the picture. Serafina stepped into the room and looked at the documents. The supply orders were military provisioning requests. Food, water treatment supplies, field medical equipment, routed through the same secondary trade house as the communications she had tracked. Time to arrive in the Eastern Territories within a week of the new moon. Someone inside the Citadel had been provisioning the Ashvale Alliance's forward positions. Someone with access to Dominion supply channels. Someone who had been here long enough to know which supply routes wouldn't trigger an automatic audit review. Lyra's been here 7 weeks, Serafina said. The supply orders start 3 weeks before she arrived, Sova said. The room went very quiet. Serafina looked at the dates, looked at them again. 3 weeks before Lyra arrived, which meant the Citadel contact had been working longer than she thought, had established the channel before Lyra ever walked through the gate, had been here and trusted and functional for months before Lyra became the visible face of whatever this was. There's a second contact, she said. Sova's face confirmed it. Who? That's what I need you to tell me, Sova said, because I have the documents, and I have Bren's testimony, and I have a council session in 2 hours. But if there's a second contact and we don't know who it is, then anything we present this morning walks into a room with a compromised member, and everything collapses before it can take hold. Serafina stood at the table and looked at the supply order dates and ran every name she knew through the filter of access, timing, and motivation, and the answer sat at the back of her mind like a stone she didn't want to turn over because of what might be underneath it. Access to supply channels. Seniority enough to route requests without triggering review. Present in the Citadel for long enough. And in the council chamber this past morning, the one she was still processing as yesterday even though she hadn't slept. The person who had looked at the table instead of at her when Kalen made his accusation. Not because they were ashamed of what was happening to her, because they were ashamed of their own part in it. Kavas, she said. Sova closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 second, which for Sova was the equivalent of a longer grief. Then she opened them. I've had the same thought. Lord Kavas has been on the Trade Provisioning Committee for 4 years. He has seal-level access to supply orders. He has been friendlier with Lyra than his position required from the first week she arrived, and he was the one who shut down my frontier intelligence point in council session. She paused. And the reassignment order for Sentinel Dovar, the one that used the council seal without a session authorization, Kavas is the deputy keeper of that seal. Yes, Sova said. They looked at each other across the table with all of that between them, with the full weight of what it meant to discover that the rot had been growing from inside for longer than either of them had known. If Kavas is in the session this morning, Serafina said, we can't present the supply order evidence. He'll have a counter-argument ready, or he'll move to recess, or he'll get a message out before we can contain the damage. Then we don't present it to the full session, Sova said. We present it to Kalen directly, privately, before the session opens. Kalen won't see me. He'll see me. Sova straightened. She had the posture of someone who had been in rooms with powerful men for 50 years and had long ago stopped being impressed by any of them. He respects me even when he doesn't want to, and I'm calling this session under my authority as senior elder. He can refuse me an audience, but it will be the first time in his reign he's done it, and he'll know what it means when he does. Serafina looked at Rena, who had been standing near the door through all of this with her hands folded and her face neutral. Rena looked back at her with the specific expression that meant, I've already thought through the next 3 problems and I'm waiting for you to catch up. The documents need a second copy, Serafina said, in a separate location. Something Kavas can't reach if this goes wrong. Rena said, Done. Serafina turned back to Sova. I need 1 hour to clean up, to organize what we have, to position myself where I can enter the council chamber if we get the access. She paused. And I need you to tell me one thing. Ask. How many council members can we trust? Sova was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to show the first gray edge of dawn. Somewhere in the citadel above them, people were beginning to move, the palace waking up the way it always did, slow and inevitable and unaware. Bren, Sova said, myself. Elder Marin, if she's had time to read what I sent her last night, possibly Warden Thace. He's been uncomfortable for weeks and looking for someone to tell him what to do about it. She paused. 4, maybe 5. 14 members on the council, Serafina said. Yes. And Kavas will have his own count. Yes, Sova said again. There was no softness in the way she said it, just the acknowledgement of a professional who had been doing this work long enough to understand that the numbers were the numbers. Which is why we need Kalen, If Kalen hears this from me before the session, before Lyra has the morning to work on him, before Cavus can position himself, there is a chance. Serafina nodded once. She picked up 2 of the documents from the table, the ones with the clearest evidentiary chain, and folded them into her jacket. 1 hour, she said. She left through the connecting passage, the one most of the palace staff had forgotten existed. The hour passed in the specific texture of controlled urgency, getting cleaned up in her own quarters, which were formally no longer her quarters, but whose locks had not yet been changed, because bureaucratic diligence never moved as fast as political decisions, gathering the additional documents she had stored in the back study, reading through everything one final time with the cold attention of someone preparing to walk into a room where a single mistake would be irreversible. She was in the back study, the documents organized in front of her, 17 minutes before the emergency session was scheduled to open, when she heard the outer door. Not Rena. Rena knocked differently, 3 short and precise. This was 1 knock, then the door opening. She had time to understand that someone had a key before the door was fully open, and she was looking at Lord Cavus standing in the doorway of her private quarters, with 2 palace guards behind him, and a face that was not the face he wore in council sessions, not the thin, elaborate authority, not the performance of seniority. This was the stripped-down version. The one that had spent the night deciding and had arrived at what it decided. Serafina Vale, he said. He didn't use a title. He hadn't used one this morning in the council chamber either. She was beginning to understand the shape of the message in that. You're not supposed to be in the Citadel. She put her hands flat on the desk but didn't stand. Standing felt like acknowledging his authority over the room, and she wasn't doing that. How did you know I was here? Someone saw you come through the eastern postern. Word moves. He stepped into the room. The guard stayed in the doorway. Those documents you're looking at, I need them. No. His face moved. A small thing, a compression around the jaw. He was not a man who heard no easily. She didn't think he heard it much anymore at all. You're already exiled, he said. You're in violation of the king's order by being inside these walls. Every minute you're here, you're adding to the weight of what can be brought against you. He paused. I'm offering you a way out of this. Give me the documents. Leave. I will ensure that the exile terms are manageable, that you have access to resources. You provisioned the Ashvale Alliance's forward positions, she said, through the secondary trade house, starting 3 months ago, 7 weeks before Lyra arrived. You've been the inside contact this whole time. You pulled the council seal for Dovar's reassignment, you intercepted the frontier intelligence reports before they reached Commander Bren, and you spent the last 3 months building a case against me because you needed someone to blame when the invasion came. The room was very still. Cavus's face went through several things in the space of 2 seconds. She watched all of them and found none of them surprising, because she had been right about him, and being right about someone like this was never satisfying. It was only clarifying. Give me the documents, he said again. There are copies, she said, in 2 separate locations, both of them outside the reach of the council seal. She met his eyes and held them. If you take these, you haven't solved your problem. You've only guaranteed that when this comes out, and it will come out, because 1,200 soldiers can't stay hidden for 12 more days, and this council has Sova in it. You have no chance of any outcome except the worst one. Something shifted in his face. Not guilt. Cavus was past the stage where guilt was operative. But calculation. The recalibration of a man who has been running a plan and has just been told that one of his assumptions was wrong. Sova knows, he said. Not a question. Sova knows, she said. And she's with Kalen right now. She said it because she needed him to believe it, because if he believed it, the arrest order he had prepared became a liability rather than a solution, and the guards in the doorway became witnesses to his exposure rather than instruments of it. She said it and watched it land. And in the half-second while Cavus was recalculating, while his eyes moved to the documents and back to her face and back to the documents, while the guards in the doorway stood with the particular attention of men who sensed that the room had shifted but hadn't yet been told in which direction, in that half-second, she became aware of something wrong. Sova was not with Kalen. She knew this because she could hear from somewhere in the corridor above her the sound of voices, raised, urgent, the quality of voices in a space that was supposed to be private being invaded by something that wasn't invited. She knew the acoustic properties of this citadel the way she knew the maps. The voices were coming from the wing above her private quarters, Sova's quarters. She was on her feet before the thought finished forming. "Stop her," Kavas said. The guards moved. She was already past the desk, toward the connecting passage, the one most people had forgotten. She hit the passage door with her shoulder, got it open, heard one of the guards crash into the desk behind her. Heavier man, less familiar with the geometry of the room. The passage was narrow and dark, and she navigated it from memory alone, moving fast, taking the turn toward the upper access stairs, hearing footsteps behind her that were too close. She came up through the upper passage access into the corridor outside Sova's quarters and stopped. 3 palace guards outside Sova's door. Not the standard rotation. The king's personal detail, boss. The heavy armor, the red and black insignia. The door was closed. From behind it, she could hear Sova's voice, controlled, measured, the voice of a woman who was not afraid but who was constrained, and Kaelin's voice, low and specific, and carrying the tone she had last heard in the council chamber when he stripped her of her title. Not deliberation, conclusion. He had already decided. She understood in that moment, with the full weight of everything she was, that someone had gotten to him before Sova. That the morning had moved faster than she had planned for. That the variable she had not fully accounted for was not Kavas or Lyra or the frontier formations, but the fact that Kaelin had been awake since before dawn, and had spent the pre-dawn hours in a conversation that had arrived at an outcome before Sova walked through his door. She looked at the king's personal detail outside Sova's door and understood that Sova had been brought to Kaelin's quarters, not the other way around, and that whatever was happening behind that door was not an audience. It was a containment. The footsteps from the passage behind her were going to emerge in approximately 20 seconds. She looked at the door. She looked at the guards. She looked at the corridor both ways. The exit to her left led toward the outer citadel, toward the postern gate, toward the eastern road, and Devon and the frontier network that was waiting for her direction. The way out. The door to her right led to Kaelin. She thought about the supply order dates, 3 months before Lyra arrived. The plan predated Lyra's arrival in the citadel, which meant it predated Kaelin's entanglement with Lyra, which meant she ran that thread fast and hard, the way she ran numbers in council sessions, the way she had always been faster at this than anyone gave her credit for, which meant the plan had not been built around Lyra's access to Kaelin. It had been built around Kaelin's trust in Kavas. Lyra was not the architect. Lyra was the instrument. The architect had been inside the citadel for 4 years, seated on the council, with access to provisioning and intelligence and the king's ear through decades of accumulated proximity. Kavas had not been recruited by the Ashvale Alliance. Kavas had recruited the Ashvale Alliance. The passage door behind her opened. She turned to face the guard who came through it, young, uncertain, following an order he hadn't had time to fully understand. And she made the choice in the single second available to her, the only choice that the situation permitted if she was going to be useful to anyone in the next 12 days. She did not go through Kaelin's door. She ran. Down the left corridor, past the secondary access, through the outer citadel ground level at a speed that pulled looks from every servant and functionary she passed, out through the postern gate that was still unlatched from her entry, into the gray pre-dawn where Aldrich was still waiting with the horse, because Aldrich was a frontier scout, and frontier scouts did not abandon their post until they were told to. She was in the saddle in 4 seconds, moving in 5. Behind her, she heard the gate open again. Heard voices, heard, faintly, the particular sound of organized pursuit beginning to organize itself. She did not look back. She rode east with everything she had learned burning in the front of her mind like a map redrawn in real time. Kavas, not Lyra. The invasion timeline, not manipulated but designed by someone who had spent 4 years inside the Dominion's governing structure learning exactly where the weaknesses were. Sova contained, Bren's evidence in a room with a compromised occupant, the emergency session about to open with the wrong people in control of the room. And Kaelin, behind a door with the king's personal detail outside it, believing whatever Kavas had told him in the hours before dawn. She pushed the horse harder. She had 11 days until the new moon. She had a map with 4 invasion positions and a command element she'd now re-identified. She had Farron's scout network and Deverin's rider contacts and the documentation that Rena had copied to a second location Cavis didn't know about. She had lost the council chamber and lost the access to Kaelin, and lost Sova to a containment she hadn't anticipated. What she had not lost, what she could not afford to lose, what was the only non-replaceable asset she carried, was the full picture. She was the only person outside the Ashvale Alliance itself who understood the complete structure of what was coming and who had built it. That was the ground she had to work from. The frontier spread out ahead of her, cold and gray in the early morning, and she rode into it with the specific quality of attention that had nothing in it of fear and everything in it of a woman who has just understood, at full depth, the nature of the thing she is fighting. Not a jealous woman and a manipulated king, not a palace intrigue with frontier consequences, but a 4-year dismantling of a kingdom's defenses by a man who had stood in its council chamber and eaten its food and used its trust as a tool against it. Everything she had planned for the next 11 days had just been made irrelevant. She was going to have to become something she had never been before. Not a queen making her case through legitimate channels. Not a strategist working from inside an institution. Something rawer than that. Something the institution had no mechanism to contain because she was no longer inside it. The horse hit the open plateau, and she gave it its head, and they ran. She had 9 days left when she stopped running and started building. The decision happened somewhere on the plateau, between the 2nd and 3rd mile of the hard ride east, in the specific moment when the horse's breathing and the gray dawn light and the full architecture of what she now understood converged into a single point of clarity. She had been operating on the assumption that the institution could be saved from inside, that if she got the right information to the right people through the right channels, the system would correct itself. That assumption was gone. Cavis had spent 4 years making sure there was no inside left to work from, which left outside. She pulled the horse down to a working canter and started thinking differently. The frontier network was the asset, not the council, not the palace, not the chain of command that Cavis had spent years quietly compromising. The frontier network, Farron's scouts, Deverin's riders, the settlement contacts at Dusk Hollow, and the 2 others she knew about further east, was operating outside the structures Cavis had access to. It was informal, underfunded, and sustained entirely by the particular stubbornness of people who cared about the kingdom more than they cared about their position within it. It was also the only part of the Silver Dominion's defense apparatus that was still intact. She rode to Farron's position first. The scout unit's forward camp was 3 hours east of the capital, set back from the main road in a shallow depression the terrain hid well. She came in from the southern approach the way Farron had described, the way that identified her as known rather than threat, and she was in the camp and looking at Farron's face before the morning light had fully established itself. He took one look at her and said, "It went wrong." "Cavis," she said. "He's the primary contact. 4 years. He's been building the access structure the whole time." Farron absorbed that with the particular stillness of someone whose mental map has just been redrawn at scale. Then he said, "What do you need?" This was why she had ridden to him first. Not because he had the most resources, but because he had the fastest comprehension-to-action ratio of anyone she'd encountered in the last 48 hours. And right now, that mattered more than resources. "Full picture of your network," she said. "Every contact, every position, every unit that's been filing reports that disappeared. I need to know what we actually have out here." He talked for 20 minutes. She asked questions. By the end of it, she had a working count. 11 scout units operating along the eastern approaches, all of them under-resourced and communication dark because their reports had been intercepted. Most of them still holding their positions because frontier scouts held their positions until they were told otherwise, and no one had told them otherwise. Combined, they represented close to 200 trained fighters who were awake, armed, and watching an invasion build from 30 yards outside its forward positions. 200 fighters against 1,200 was not a battle. But 200 fighters who knew the terrain, who had spent weeks watching the enemy's movement patterns, who could hit 4 separate positions simultaneously and disappear before a coordinated response could form, that was not a battle either. That was something else. something that didn't have to win. It only had to buy time. Time enough for the council chamber to understand what was coming before it arrived at the gate. "I need a rider to Devon," she said. "Today, with a specific message. Done. And I need your unit here operational and ready to move by nightfall." Farron looked at her, then at his unit, 8 scouts in various states of rest and readiness, all of them watching this conversation with the focused attention of people who have been waiting for someone to show up and tell them the situation has changed. "Hey," he said to them, not loudly, just a word. They turned. He looked at Serafina. "Tell them yourself." She looked at the 8 people looking back at her. Frontier scouts. Young, most of them, worn at the edges from weeks of watching and waiting and filing reports into a void. They didn't know her title because she no longer had one. They knew her face from the report she'd written that shaped their protocols, from the fortification designs she'd argued for that had kept them alive during the border raids 2 years ago. They knew her work even if they hadn't known her name. She told them the full picture, not a version of it. All of it. Kavas, the timeline, the 4 formation positions, the command element, the supply lines, the intercepted reports, the council situation, the 9 days. She told it the way she wrote intelligence briefs, which was to say, without softening and without unnecessary weight, just the shape of what was true. When she finished, no one spoke for a moment. Then the scout to Farron's left, a woman in her late 20s with a sheathed blade across her back and dried mud on her boots that had been there long enough to crack, said, "So we're fighting for a kingdom that threw out the one person who knew what the hell she was doing." "Yes," Serafina said, "and the king still thinks you're the problem." "Right now, yes." The scout looked at her for a second longer. Then she said, "Okay." Just that. "Okay." The way you said it when the situation was what it was, and arguing about it was a luxury the timeline didn't offer. That was the moment Serafina understood they were with her. Not because of her title, not because of her authority, not because of the institution she represented, which had just publicly expelled her. Because of the work. Because they had been doing the right thing alone in the dark for weeks, and someone had finally shown up who understood what they'd been looking at. She had been a queen for 11 years. This felt different, rawer, more honest. The next 6 days were the hardest of her life, and she was not the kind of person who made that assessment lightly. She moved between settlement contacts and scout positions, riding at night, sleeping in 4-hour intervals when the schedule allowed it, building the coordination structure that 200 dispersed fighters needed to become something more than a collection of individuals making separate decisions. Devon's riders carried messages between positions faster than any official dispatch network could manage because they were not using official dispatch routes. Farron became her operational right hand, moving between units, verifying positions, reporting back. She ate what was available. She stopped noticing whether it was good. Her court dress had been left at Dusk Hollow, replaced by frontier gear that fit imperfectly and didn't matter. Her hands, which had spent 11 years in the particular condition of a woman who did physical work but always had access to clean water and shelter, acquired a roughness she noticed the first 2 days and stopped noticing after that. The thing she noticed instead was what happened inside the scout units as the coordination structure took shape. People who had been operating in isolation, who had been filing reports into a void and feeling the particular corrosion of doing the right thing to no effect, those people changed when they understood they were part of a larger picture that someone was actively managing. Not dramatically, just the specific way that competent people change when competence is being used rather than wasted. She thought about Kaylin. She thought about it more than she wanted to, in the hours between positions when the riding was long enough that her mind had room to move. She thought about the man who had looked at her in the council chamber and used the word "my judgment" as though it were a wall rather than a position. She thought about what 4 years of Kavas's proximity had done to that judgment. Not corrupted it, exactly, but narrowed it, shaped it, trimmed away the parts that complicated the picture Kavas wanted him to see, the way you trim a tree to grow toward the light that suits you. Kaylin was not a stupid man. He was not a bad man, not at his core. He was a man who had been managed and had not known it, and the tragedy of it was not that he had been wrong, but that he had been made wrong by someone he trusted, which was the oldest wound in the architecture of power. She had loved him once. She had respected him, which for her was harder and more durable than love. She was not sure what she felt now, moving across the eastern frontier in the dark, building the thing that might save the kingdom he was currently holding together with compromised information and misplaced faith. Something simpler than love, something more like the specific responsibility of being the only person in the right position to do the necessary thing. On the 7th day, Devrin found her at the northern position with news from inside the capital. Sova was released from containment, he said. He was breathing hard from the ride. 2 days ago, Kaelin apparently drew a line at holding a senior elder under house confinement without formal charges. Whatever Kavis wanted, Kaelin wasn't willing to go that far. Is she mobile? She's calling the council back to session. Full session, tomorrow morning. Bren's with her. He paused. Kavis is moving to block it. He's filing a procedural challenge under the governance code. Says the emergency session she called earlier wasn't properly convened and that any council action since then is invalid. He's buying time, she said. Yes. He needs the council paralyzed for 2 more days. New moon is in 2 days. Yes, Devrin said again. She looked at the map. The 4 formation positions had been updated by Farron's scouts over the past 6 days. The units were moving, beginning the slow forward tilt of a force that has stopped staging and started positioning. They would begin their approach runs the night of the new moon. The timing was designed around darkness and the particular intelligence gap that occurred when the Frontier Watch shifted at new moon because the reduced light made the rotation more complex, and there was always a gap. She had been the one who had originally identified that gap in a border security review 3 years ago. She had recommended a protocol fix. The recommendation had been tabled pending budget review. She put one hand flat on the map and held it there. 2 days. Tell me about the procedural challenge, she said. Devrin told her. She listened. When he finished, she said, It's not going to hold. Sova knows the governance code better than anyone alive. She'll have a counterargument ready within the hour. But counterarguments take time, and Kavis knows that. So what do? We changed the question, she said. Kavis can paralyze a council debate. He can't paralyze physical evidence. She straightened. If the frontier forces move before new moon, if they're still in their positions when dawn comes on the new moon, and the council can see real-time scout testimony rather than documents that can be challenged, the procedural argument dies. You can't procedurally challenge something the entire council can see happening in front of them. You want to provoke an early move. No, I want them to make the same move they were already planning, just slightly ahead of schedule. And I want every scout unit position to document exactly what they see and ride to the capital with it simultaneously. She looked up at him. 12 riders, 12 directions. Even if Kavis catches 2 of them, 10 get through. And 10 testimonies from frontier scouts who have been on the ground for weeks is not a document that can be dismissed. Devrin looked at her. He had the face of a man who was calculating risk and finding the numbers acceptable, which was different from finding them comfortable. And you, he said, where will you be? Inside the capital, she said. When the testimony arrives, I need to be there to present the complete picture. The documentation, the scout reports, the supply order timeline, all of it at once, in open session, before Kavis has time to construct a response. They'll arrest you the moment you walk through the gate. Only if Kavis has the authority to order it, she said. And in 2 days, I'm going to make sure he doesn't. What? The night before the new moon, she rode back toward the capital for the second time in 9 days, and this was different from the first time in every way that mattered. The first time she had been riding toward a council chamber, toward an institution, toward the structures of governance she understood and had worked within for 11 years. She had been trying to fix a system from inside. This time she was riding toward a reckoning. The difference lived in her body as much as her mind, in the way her hands sat on the reins, in the way her jaw was set, in the particular quality of alertness that had replaced the calculation she was used to carrying. Not recklessness. She was not the kind of person who confused recklessness with courage, but a clarity that came from having stripped away every option that didn't work until the one that remained was visible in its entirety. Aldrich met her at the old approach, 5 miles from the capital, with 6 frontier scouts and horses for all of them. Devrin's riders are positioned, he said. All 12. They move at your signal. The signal is dawn, she said. The moment the eastern sky shows color, they ride. All of them, simultaneously. Understood. He looked at her. The postern gate is being watched differently tonight. Someone tightened the patrol rotation. Kavas. Probably. There are 3 guards instead of 1, and the cycle is irregular. She thought about that. 3 guards with an irregular cycle meant the standard 6-minute gap was closed. It also meant someone inside the Citadel had told Kavas she used the postern gate the last time, which meant someone in the inner corridor had been watching. There's another way in, she said, the secondary drainage access on the north side. It was designed as an emergency evacuation route. Most people don't know it exists. You do. I helped design it. Aldrich looked at her with the expression people got when they realized they were dealing with someone who had been many things and was now something that included all of them. Lead. They moved toward the capital through the dark, 7 riders in controlled silence, and Serafina felt the weight of the next hours settle across her shoulders with the specific gravity of things that have been building for a long time and have arrived at their necessary point. She did not think about what she would say to Kaelin. She had prepared the words and set them aside. What she said would depend on what she found, and she had learned in 9 days of frontier living that preparation was not the same as rigidity, that the people who survived the worst situations were the ones who could hold the plan and the present moment simultaneously without letting either override the other. She thought instead about the frontier scouts riding toward the capital with 12 separate testimonies in 12 separate directions. She thought about Sova awake in the Citadel, waiting. She thought about Farron out on the eastern plateau with his unit, watching. She thought about the things she had been in this kingdom for 11 years, the architecture, the unseen structure, the work that held the visible surface in place. And she thought about the fact that you did not see architecture until it was gone. The people walked on floors and through doorways for years without understanding the calculation that kept those structures standing, and that the best thing an architect could do, finally, was let the building show exactly what it was made of. The north wall came up dark ahead of her. She found the drainage access by feel, the way you found things you had placed there deliberately, long ago, in the part of your mind that saved locations for when you needed them. The iron grate was heavy. She got it open with Aldrich's help and went through first, into the dark under the Citadel's foundations, moving by memory. Above her, the Citadel was beginning to stir with the first sounds of the pre-dawn hours, footsteps, voices, the mechanical rhythms of a palace waking up. She came up through the access point into a storage corridor she had walked exactly once before, during a security review 4 years ago. She oriented herself by the smell of the stone and the direction of the draft, and started moving. She had maybe 2 hours before dawn. She used every minute of them. She was in the lower council antechamber, positioned, documents organized, with Sova standing 15 feet away and Bren beside her and 3 other council members she recognized, when the door opened and Kaelin walked in. He stopped when he saw her. The room stopped with him. That specific arrested quality of a space in which the most important thing is happening and everyone present knows it. He looked at her for a long time. She let him look. She let him see the frontier clothes, the 9 days of hard travel in her face, the documents in her hands, the fact that she was standing in a room she had been expelled from by his own public order and was not apologizing for it and was not going to. Serafina, he said. Kaelin, she said, sit down. We have about 90 minutes before this council chamber fills up, and you're going to want to hear what I have to say before that happens. Something moved through his face, old and complicated and carrying more than this moment. He looked at Sova, who met his gaze with the particular quality of an elder who had already decided and was waiting for him to catch up. He looked at Bren, whose face said the same thing. He looked back at Serafina. She held the documents out toward him, not as a supplication, as an offer between people who still had time to choose correctly if they moved now. He took 1 step toward her. The door on the far side of the chamber opened. Kavas walked through it with 4 palace guards and Lyra Thorne at his left shoulder, and his face when he saw the room was not surprise. It was the face of someone who had prepared for this specific eventuality and had arrived at their own decision about it well in advance. Arrest her, he said. The guards moved. Kaelin turned to look at Kavas. Something was happening in his face. The slow, violent waking of a man who has been given something he cannot dismiss in the moment before the people who need him not to see it have arrived to manage the damage. Serafina stood in the antechamber and watched it, and understood that everything in the next 30 seconds depended on whether Kaelin was still the man she had known before Cavus had finished making him into something else. The guards were 6 feet away. Kaelin had not moved. She looked at him. Not a plea, not a performance of vulnerability, but the direct, unflinching attention of someone who had built this kingdom beside him and run 9 days across hostile terrain to save it, and was now standing in front of him with the truth in both hands and nothing left to spend. "Kaelin," she said. One word, his name, everything in it. The guards reached her, and Kaelin Draven, Alpha King of the Silver Dominion, said one word. The room hung on it. "Stand down." That was the word. 2 syllables. Kaelin's voice, low and absolute, carrying the specific register of a man who has made a decision that he cannot unmake and knows it. The guards stopped. The room held the silence of the moment after something breaks. Not the loud breaking, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet structural kind. The kind that happens when a weight-bearing thing finally gives, and the whole shape of what it was holding up shifts at once. Cavus stood in the doorway and looked at Kaelin with the face of a man recalculating in real time. The calculation was visible. He had prepared for this eventuality. He had said so with the way he walked in. But preparation and the actual arrival of a thing are never quite the same, and what he saw on Kaelin's face was not the manageable uncertainty of a man still persuadable. It was the face of someone who had arrived at a shore. "My king," Cavus said, "this woman has violated the terms of her exile. She is inside these walls illegally." "I know where she is," Kaelin said. He did not look at Cavus when he said it. He was looking at Serafina. "I can see exactly where she is." He crossed the room, not toward Cavus, toward her. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at the documents in her hands with the focused attention of a man who is finally, at significant cost, allowing himself to see something clearly. "Show me," he said. She showed him. Bushan. It took 40 minutes. She laid it out the way she always laid out intelligence, sequentially, without editorializing, letting the structure of the evidence carry its own argument. The supply order timeline, the routing records from the secondary trade house, Farron's scout reports, the originals, with the interception gap visible in the filing dates, the communication pattern between the Citadel contact and the Ashvale Alliance's forward command, timed against the 3 months of deteriorating frontier conditions, the formation map, the command element position, the provisioning of forward positions with Dominion supply chain resources, and Cavus's name attached to each piece by access records, seal usage, and the 11-hour gap in the reassignment order for Sentinel Dovar. Kaelin read every page. He did not ask her to slow down or clarify. He had the reading speed of someone who had spent years processing intelligence briefings, and she watched his face move through the material with the specific quality of a man understanding not just what is in front of him, but what it means about everything behind him, about the past 4 years, about every decision that had been shaped by an advisor who was steering rather than serving, about the woman standing across from him who had tried to tell him this 6 weeks ago in his private study and been told she was reading shadows. When he finished, he set the last document on the table. He did not speak immediately. In the doorway, Cavus had not moved. Lyra had taken 2 steps back, which was involuntary, and told its own story. Sova said from across the room, "The council session opens in 40 minutes. Kaelin looked up at Cavus. 4 years, he said. His voice had no elevation in it, no theatrical weight, just the flat factual quality of a man who is saying something true and finds the truth sufficient. "You've been in my council for 4 years. Cavus opened his mouth. "Don't," Kaelin said. One word. Cavus closed his mouth. Kaelin turned to Bren. "Take him into custody. Full containment, no communications, no access to the seal or any council instrument, and bring Lyra Thorne in separately." He paused. "I'll hear from both of them after the session." Bren moved with the controlled efficiency of a man who had been waiting for exactly this order and had prepared for it so thoroughly that it required no improvisation at all. Cavus went without physical resistance. He had the bearing of someone who had already identified his next move and was conserving energy for it. Serafina watched him go and noted the calculation in his posture, and filed it. He still had lines out, still had pieces in play, and whatever the council session produced this morning would need to be airtight enough that none of those lines could be pulled to useful effect. Lara Thorne looked at Serafina once before Bren's second took her arm. The look was not fear exactly. It was the look of someone who had played a long and sophisticated game and has arrived at the moment where the game resolves and is now in the business of finding out whether they played it well enough. There was almost something professional in it. Serafina met it without expression and let Lyra be walked out. The room was quiet. Kalen turned back to Serafina. He looked at her for a long moment. The frontier clothes, the road wear, the 9 days of what this had cost written in her face in ways she wasn't bothering to conceal. His own face was doing something she hadn't seen it do in a long time, maybe ever. Not the public face, not the council face, not even the private face of the man she had been married to. Something beneath all of those, raw and specific and carrying the weight of someone who has looked at the gap between what they did and what they should have done and found it wider than they can easily live with. "You rode back," he said. "Yes. After everything He stopped. The word was insufficient, and he knew it. "The kingdom needed it," she said. "That's not why I'm asking." She looked at him steadily. The room was still occupied. Sova, Bren, the 3 council members, Aldrich near the door. None of them were pretending not to hear this. This was not a private conversation. It hadn't been a private anything for a long time. "I know," she said. "We'll talk about the rest after." He nodded once. It was the nod of a man accepting terms he knows he doesn't deserve, which was the most honest thing she had seen from him in months. She took it for what it was and turned toward the council chamber door. "Serafina," Sova said quietly from beside her. She was holding the second copy of the documents, the ones Rena had preserved. "You should know. The frontier riders started arriving 20 minutes ago. The first 3 testimonies are already in the hands of Elder Marin and Warden Thace." Dawn had broken then. Farron's network had moved exactly when she had said to move. She let herself feel that for exactly 1 second. The clean satisfaction of a plan that held under pressure, of people who had trusted her judgment and not been wrong to do so. And then she walked into the council chamber. The session lasted 3 hours. Kavis's procedural challenge collapsed under Sova's counterargument in the first 20 minutes, which was 12 minutes longer than it should have taken, and was the result of 2 council members who had been sitting on their discomfort for weeks and needed the space of those 12 minutes to understand which way they were going to land. They landed correctly. Sova's preparation was comprehensive enough that there was no mechanism left to exploit. The frontier testimony came in waves. Riders arrived at 40-minute intervals throughout the session, each one carrying scout documentation from a different position, each one adding another layer to the picture until the picture was complete enough that the 3 remaining council members who had been positioned closest to Kavas spent the middle third of the session in the specific silence of people who have been following the wrong signal and are recalibrating their understanding of everything they thought they knew. Serafina presented the full evidentiary case in the second hour. She stood at the front of the council chamber in frontier clothes with 9 days of hard terrain in her face, and she spoke for 40 minutes without notes, from memory, because she had been building this case for 3 months and knew every piece of it at the cellular level. She spoke with the precision and economy of someone who understood that the quality of the argument was the argument, that performance would undermine rather than support what she had to show, that the evidence was the most powerful thing in the room and her job was to stay out of its way. When she finished, the chamber was quiet for a long moment. Elder Marin, who was 73 years old and had served 4 successive rulers and had the judgment of someone who had watched many things fail from insufficient attention to what was actually true, said, "We need to address the frontier positions tonight." "Yes," Serafina said. "The new moon is tomorrow. If we move on the command element position tonight, the southeastern location I marked, we disrupt the coordination capacity before the assault formations can receive their final movement orders. They won't advance without confirmation from command. They're a professional force. They follow their structure." "You want to cut the head," Bren said. "I want to cut the head." The 4 corridor units are large enough that engaging them directly is costly. The command element is 200. Hit that position tonight, capture or scatter the coordination command, and the advance stalls without us having to fight a forefront engagement. She paused. We have 6 hours of daylight left. It's enough. Kaelin, who had been seated at the high position through the entire session without speaking, not deferring but listening, with the focused quality of a man who has understood that the most useful thing he can do right now is hear everything clearly, said, Bren, position the Dominion's full response force at Seraphina's disposal for this operation. Bren looked at him. My king, standard protocol requires... Seraphina knows the terrain, the formation positions, and the command element location, Kaelin said. She built the operational picture. Give her the force. A silence. Then Bren said, Yes, my king. And the thing that happened in the room after that was not a dramatic shift, but a settling. The specific settling of an institution finding its correct shape after having been distorted for too long. Young. The operation took 4 hours. She rode with Bren's force to the southeastern position, moved them in from 3 directions using the terrain knowledge Farron's scouts had spent 3 weeks accumulating, hit the command element at dusk when the light was in the wrong direction for the defenders, and the frontier scouts knew every fold of the ground. It was not a clean operation. Clean was for situations with more time and more information. This was sufficient, which was the standard that mattered. The command element's commanding officer surrendered when the 3rd defensive position collapsed. He was a professional. He understood the geometry of the situation, and he had no attachment to the outcome that outweighed his survival calculus. He surrendered, and his force surrendered with him, and Seraphina stood on the eastern plateau in the last of the dusk light, and felt the specific quality of exhaustion that lives on the far side of sustained intensity. Not depletion, not relief, but the body's honest accounting of what it had spent. Farron appeared at her right shoulder from somewhere in the dark behind her, which was characteristic of him. The 4 corridor units are standing down. Word is moving through their network. Without command confirmation, they're not advancing. Good. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're bleeding. She looked down. Her left forearm, a cut from the first exchange she hadn't registered in the time since. Not deep. Not the kind that required urgent attention. I know. You should... I will, she said. When we're done. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has spent 9 days watching a person operate at the outer edge of what a person can sustain and is deciding whether to say something about it. He decided not to. He had learned in those 9 days that Seraphina Vale's relationship with her own limits was not something that benefited from commentary. She appreciated that about him. She looked east, where the command element's tents were being secured by Bren's soldiers, where the frontier scouts were moving with the efficient economy of people doing what they had been trained for and had been waiting to use. She looked at the dark plateau and the first stars coming up above the ridgeline and let the night settle around her. The kingdom was going to be standing in the morning. That was the only thing she had set out to ensure, and it was sufficient. She returned to the capital 2 days after the operation, when the immediate frontier situation was stable enough that her continuous presence was no longer the determining variable. The Ashvale Alliance's 4 corridor units had formally withdrawn. Their commanding officers had sent communication through intermediary channels, professional, bloodless, the language of forces that had been neutralized and were seeking the least costly resolution. The terms were manageable. The border would hold. Cavis's full interrogation had produced, in the way that thorough interrogations eventually do, a complete account of the 4 years. It was worse in some details than she had expected and better in others, which was the nature of the full picture. It was always more specific than the outline, always more human, and therefore more complicated than the architecture of the plan suggested. Lyra Thorne had confessed to her part without much pressure, which told Seraphina something about the relationship between Lyra and Cavis, that Lyra had been a tool that knew it was a tool and had no particular investment in protecting the hand that had used her. Seraphina found she did not have strong feelings about Lyra Thorne. The woman had done what she had done and would be held to account for it. What Seraphina found herself thinking about instead, in the quiet of the second night after the operation, was the shape of how it had been possible. Cavis had been inside the structure for 4 years. He had been trusted because he had earned the surface appearance of trust, through proximity and consistency, and the slow accumulation of small reliabilities that people read as loyalty. He had understood something that most people in the rooms of power never examined directly, that the real vulnerability of any governing structure was not its defenses, but its assumptions. What a system assumed did not need to be examined. What was assumed was the ground everyone stood on without looking down. He had become an assumption. And from inside an assumption, a patient man could do enormous damage. The lesson did not resolve into a simple principle. It never did, when the thing you were learning from had actually hurt you. It resolved instead into a specific change in how she looked at rooms. Not with more suspicion exactly, but with more respect for what she didn't know, which was different. Kaylin came to her on the third day. She was in the small back study, her own, the one that connected through the passage most of the palace had forgotten, going through the documentation that would form the basis of the border settlement terms. She heard his knock, and then she heard it again, and then she said, "Come in," because she knew his knock from 11 years of living in the same structure, and she was not going to perform not knowing it. He came in. He looked at the study, at the maps and documents, at the work that had occupied the room while she had been away, and had now returned to the room with her. He looked at her. He sat down without being invited, and she let that stand because it was the right instinct. "I've been trying to find the words since the council session," he said. "Take your time." "I don't think there are words that are adequate to this." "Probably not," she said. "Say them anyway." He was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man who has spent 3 days going over the accounting of a thing and has not found a way to make the numbers come out differently. "I listened to the wrong person. I let someone I trusted build a wall between me and everything else I trusted, and I didn't see it because I wanted to believe the simpler picture, the one where you were the problem." He paused. "Because if you were the problem had a solution. And if the problem was me, if the problem was that I had been managed for years by someone inside my own council, then I had to look at everything I thought I knew and ask which parts of it were real." "And that was harder," she said. "Yes." She set down the document she had been reviewing and looked at him directly. He was thinner than he had been 9 days ago. She didn't think he had been sleeping. She recognized the specific texture of a person who has been sitting inside a reckoning and not been able to find the bottom of it. "Kaylin," she said, "what you did, the accusation, the public stripping of the title, the exile, I'm not going to tell you it was small. It wasn't. I walked out of that gate with nothing, and I knew in that moment that you had chosen to believe something about me that was false, and you had made that choice in public, and whatever the reason, I had to carry it." He held that without deflecting. "And I came back," she said, "not for you. The kingdom needed someone who knew what was happening, and I was the one who knew. That's the simple version." She paused. "The less simple version is that I came back because I have spent 11 years building something here that is larger than either of us, and I was not going to let it be destroyed because one man made the wrong call at the wrong time under the wrong influence. I was angry enough to ride through the night and angry enough to build a frontier operation from nothing, and I used that anger the way you're supposed to use it, as fuel, not as a decision." "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask. Is there a way that we—" He stopped. The sentence didn't have the ending he needed. He tried again. "I am not asking you to return to what we were. I understand that's not what you're offering. I'm asking if what we built here, what you built here, is something you're willing to stay and continue, not as my queen, as yourself, whatever form that takes." She looked at him for a long time. Outside the window, the capital was going about its morning. The market district, the outer fortifications, the infrastructure of a functioning kingdom that had come within 2 days of being taken apart from the inside. She thought about what it meant to forgive someone. Not the performance of it, not the declaration. The actual mechanical work of deciding that what a person had done was not the final definition of what they were. She had been thinking about it for 9 days on the frontier, in the hours when the riding was long and the mind had room. She had thought about whether she was capable of it, and had arrived, without much drama, at the understanding that she was, not because the wound was small, but because she had looked at Kaylin in the council antechamber and seen the moment he chose correctly, and that moment was real. and real things had weight, and the weight of a correct choice under maximum pressure was not nothing. Forgiveness was not restoration. It was not the undoing of the distance. It was just the decision to stop spending energy on the damage and redirect it toward the living. She had always been efficient with her energy. "Yes," she said. "I'll stay. Under my own terms, my own authority, answerable to this council and this kingdom, and not to the question of what we are to each other personally until we've both had time to understand what that question even means now." He nodded. The nod of a man who knows he is receiving more than he earned and is choosing to understand that clearly rather than obscure it. "The council will need restructuring," she said. "The governance code has gaps that Kavas exploited, specifically the SEAL access protocols and the intelligence reporting chain. I want to redesign both." "Yes," he said, "and the Frontier Scout Network needs to be formalized. Devon's contact structure, Farron's unit, they should be integrated into the official defense architecture with proper resourcing and a direct reporting line that bypasses the provisioning committee." "Yes," he said again. She picked the document back up. "Then we have a lot of work to do." He stood. He moved toward the door and then stopped. He turned back to look at her, and she could see him trying to find something adequate to say and not finding it, and deciding that the inadequacy was honest and the honesty was what she deserved. "For whatever it's worth," he said, "watching you build what you built out there, the network, the operation, the whole thing from nothing in 9 days," he stopped. "I knew you were capable. I'd known it for 11 years, but I had stopped seeing it. Someone made sure I stopped seeing it." He paused. "I see it now." She looked at him. "I know you do," she said. "Go to work, Kalen." He went. 3 weeks later, in the same council chamber where she had been stripped of her title and publicly accused, Seraphina Vale was invested as First Warden of the Silver Dominion, a title the senior elders had constructed specifically, drawing on governance precedents that predated the current charter, because none of the existing titles carried the right meaning and they were not willing to offer her something that didn't. First Warden was not Luna Queen. It did not carry the weight of the marriage bond, or the dynastic continuity, or the particular vulnerability of a position that depended on another person's good judgment for its legitimacy. It carried its own authority, rooted in her own capacity, accountable to the council and the governance structure, rather than to the occupant of the high seat. She had designed the terms herself. Elder Sova placed the formal seal in her hands during the investiture, not on her head, not around her neck, but in her hands, which was her own specification, because she had spent 11 years having authority conferred from above, and she was done with the symbolism of that. The seal in her hands, the work in her hands, her own. The council chamber was full. The council members who had stumbled were present. Seraphina had not moved to exclude them, had instead spent 2 weeks in the specific difficult labor of distinguishing between those who had been complicit in Kavas's plan and those who had simply been outmaneuvered by it, because those were different things, and the difference mattered for what the kingdom needed to be going forward. A governing body purged of everyone who had ever made the wrong call was a governing body that had never been tested. She wanted the ones who had been tested and had found their way back. Farron was in the chamber. He had been given a formal commission, Junior Intelligence Commander, Frontier Operations, with a direct reporting line she had written into the charter revisions herself. He stood near the back in dress uniform that fit him perfectly because it had been issued in a hurry, and he was still the same 22-year-old who had run 2 days straight because he didn't know what else to do, and she was glad of both of those things. Devon was not in the chamber. He had been offered formal recognition and had declined it in a letter that was 3 sentences long and characteristically precise. He was useful where he was. Formalization would compromise that usefulness. He would continue to operate as he had operated, and she should contact him when she needed him. She had written back in 2 sentences, confirming that she understood and that she would. Kalen stood in the high seat. He watched the investiture with an expression she had been reading for 11 years, and could not entirely read now, which she thought was probably correct, that they were both new enough versions of themselves that the old readings didn't fully apply, that they were going to have to learn each other again from something closer to honesty than they had managed the first time. That was not a simple thing. It was not a promise.
It was just a remaining possibility, which was all a remaining possibility ever was. When the investiture was complete and Sova stepped back and the council acknowledged with the formal response, Serafina stood at the front of the chamber with the seal in her hands and looked at the room, at these people, this institution, this collection of imperfect and necessary human machinery that had nearly destroyed itself and had not quite.
She thought about the creek bed where she had found the message cylinder. She thought about the hard ride east and the borrowed clothes and the cold food, eaten standing up, and the 8 scouts in the forward camp who had said okay and meant it. She thought about the drainage access under the citadel and the 40 minutes in the antechamber and Kaylin's 2 syllables landing in the silence of a room that had been holding its breath. She thought about what it cost to be the person who knew the full picture in a room full of people who didn't, and the specific loneliness of that, and the specific necessity of it, and the fact that the cost and the necessity were not in conflict. That this was just what the work was, the actual texture of it, the part that didn't appear in the formal record. The seal was warm from Sova's hands, heavier than it looked. She had not come back to this kingdom for the seal. She had not done any of it for a title or a chamber or a place at a table. She had done it because the work was the work, and the work was hers. And she was the kind of person who did not put down what she had picked up just because someone had tried to take it from her. The difference was that now the whole room knew it. She let the weight of the seal settle into her hands. She let the quiet of the chamber settle into her. She looked at the work ahead, the border settlement terms, the governance revisions, the intelligence infrastructure, the long, difficult process of rebuilding what had been compromised and strengthening what had never been strong enough. And she felt none of the things she had expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief, just the clean, forward-facing readiness of someone who has been doing the necessary thing for a long time and intends to continue. The moon was rising outside the chamber windows, full and steady over the silver dominion. Serafina Vale looked at the work. Then she began.